My ventures in jam began one afternoon when my gran was cooking jam in the kitchen just in the same way that she had for as long as I could remember, and I got really excited about it and asked her to teach me how to make jam. And the same day I ran around to the supermarket and bought some fruit and sugar and made a few jars of my own, and before they'd even cooled down I was out asking the neighbours what they thought, and they all loved my jam, and I was soon selling the products door to door all around the area and then to little shops and at farmers markets. And over the course of a year or so the business sort of grew and grew, and by the time I was 16 I decided I was going to try and turn my jam making hobby into my career. I think inevitably somebody starting a business at 14 or 15 is going to have a different outlook on the world than somebody who starts a business later in life. And in my case, there was, I suppose, an air of naivety about everything that I was doing. I felt that at 16 I could start supplying supermarkets when, maybe somebody at 30 would have felt that would have been impossible. And perhaps that naivety and willingness to just give things a shot was what made things work in my case. And, perhaps there's an advantage to being young and starting a business because of that. I would say that I've always been an entrepreneur, and from a really young age I was involved in all sorts of different money-making projects. And probably the most harebrained story of all was when I was about 10 and I visited a chicken farm with my childhood friend, and we convinced the farmer to give us a box of eggs, which we took home to my mum and dad and explained that we were going to keep them warm for a few weeks so that they would hatch out and we'd start a chicken farm in the back garden. And obviously my parents weren't particularly keen on the idea of their suburban Edinburgh back garden being turned into a chicken farm, but they let us give it a shot, not really expecting us to figure out how to hatch eggs. So we put the box of eggs on top of the Sky TV box under the telly where it was kind of warm, and amazingly a few weeks later, 4 of the eggs hatched. And the poor things probably thought that Jeremy Kyle was their mum, but a few weeks later they were out in the back garden and we'd given them names and they were laying eggs, and that was my first ever little business. Unfortunately my chicken farming career was sadly cut short when the local fox decided to eat my chickens for dinner, but it didn't put me off, and I continued to come up with more and more ideas. I think when I was about 16 or 17, I heard about a Waitrose Meet the Buyer Day, and I went along. And Meet the Buyer Days I like to describe as the X factor of selling groceries to supermarkets, and I was given 10 minutes to pitch my idea to the senior jam buyer of Waitrose, and he thought it was very refreshing to see a teenager trying to reinvent something that's been around for hundreds of years. But he explained to me that there was a long way to go until I would have a product that would be ready to sit on the shelves of Waitrose. I'd have to set up production, create a brand, and go back to him at the right price before he would even think about selling my products. But he did promise that if I could do that, I could go back in maybe a year's time and he would, give the products a shot. So I then spent, about a year convincing a factory to work with me, working with an ad agency to create the branding, and doing a lot of work on the recipes until they worked on a big scale. Obviously, as a 17-year-old, the option of building my own factory was out of the question. That would have cost millions of pounds that I simply didn't have. So I had to convince an existing factory to work with me to produce SuperJam on a big scale. So I travelled around the country from the tiny little islands off the north coast of Scotland to the big cities of England, trying to convince somebody to work with me to produce this SuperJam. And obviously most of these huge publicly listed food companies were a bit sceptical of a 17-year-old coming along with no experience, no money, and in fact little more than just a set of recipes and this vague ambition to transform the world of jam. But eventually I found one factory who had suffered from the decline in jam sales. They had a lot of spare capacity in their factory, and they thought that maybe SuperJam would be the answer to their problems. So they agreed to work with me, and we spent a few months figuring out how to produce the recipes on a big scale, and at that point we were able to start supplying supermarkets. After meeting with Waitrose, I went away and worked with an ad agency to create the SuperJam brand, and there's obviously a link between SuperJam and Superman, or so we thought at the time, and decided to create the branding around a comic book theme, and we came up with labels and had a lot of fun writing jokes on the labels, and we excitedly spoke of making a superhero costume for me, the Jam Boy, to wear at the launch of SuperJam. So we then presented all of this back to the buyer, and he explained that this idea didn't really work. It was perhaps a bit childish, if not even though it was a lot of fun. So I then went back and we redid the labels and kind of went through the process a few times until eventually we came up with a set of labels and a factory and a price that worked for everyone, and he was willing to give it a shot on the shelves. When I was about 15, I was written about in the local newspaper, and I found myself on page 3 of the Edinburgh Evening News, a whole page article, and probably just meant there wasn't very much going on in Edinburgh that day. But following being featured in the local paper, an entrepreneur who had been quite successful in building a food company got in touch and said that, you know, if I wanted any advice, I could meet up with him and he would share some of the lessons that he'd learned in building his company. And even now, about 5 years later, he still meets up with me every few months and gives me advice, and we've become very good friends. And I think people often imagine that business is very ruthless and that there aren't people out there to support you, but you know, I've found it very refreshing and you know, warming to find the number of people that have been willing to give me support. The key to a good mentoring relationship is friendship, and you know, in my case, I've become a good friend with the person who has been giving me advice, and I think that he finds it very exciting to learn about my business and you know, to have a part in shaping, you know, a young company like mine is an exciting thing. So from his point of view, it's fun and exciting, and I think that perhaps you know, a lot of people helped him get to where he is, and he feels an obligation perhaps to help other people, and you know, that's very refreshing, and it's very kind of him to spend time with me. The two most effective ways that I've found of promoting the products are sampling, so just letting people taste the products, and we do that at, you know, big events, and in stores we hand out samples of jam, and that's kind of the focus of marketing the brand, just getting people to taste it, and you know, hopefully they realise that, you know, how good it is, and we can teach them about the fact that it's made entirely from fruit and fruit juice. Aside from that, we print quite a lot of money off coupons, like most grocery brands, and we've printed maybe 40 million money off coupons so far this year. We gave away a free jar with a major newspaper a couple of weeks ago. That was the biggest promotion we've ever done, so it was on the front page of the Sun's Susan Boyle special edition of the newspaper, and there was an advert on page 3 beside the naked model, half a page inside. So that was, you know, a huge promotion, and you know, did a lot for the brand perhaps. Last week I was grateful to receive a Big Hearted Scotland Award, and that was an award that was given to the SuperJam tea parties, which is a project that I set up about a year ago. And to give you a bit of background, when my gran originally made jam, she would make jam and scones and cakes and visit all the elderly people in her area who were living alone, and nobody really visited them, nobody really cared about them often. And she would take my little brother and I with her at the weekends, and my brother would play his guitar and I would tell them stories, and it's kind of something that we were always brought up with and that my gran felt very strongly about. And so about a year ago I started running tea parties in community centres, schools, workplaces, even just people's homes. And in the past year we've had about 120 parties, the biggest ones. We've had up to 500 guests. We have live music and dancing, and obviously scones and jam and afternoon tea. And for a lot of the elderly people, it's, you know, just a great opportunity to get out of their home or their care home and, you know, make some new friends and have a bit of a laugh. And you know, I've got loads of letters from some of the guests who've come along and telling me how much it means to them. And you know, it's a project that I'm very ambitious for, and hopefully will do good for lots of people.